Today, I have the privilege of introducing you to one of the most fascinating men I've never met, in person, that is. James Roth, or Jim as he prefers to be called, spent 30 years of his life as an attorney fighting for human rights. He currently serves on the board at One Voice in Minneapolis, a city that's experienced daily protests now for more than 2 weeks following the killing of local resident George Floyd. With so many years of advocacy for human rights and an unwavering commitment to board service, you can expect to hear a variety of stories in what might just be a stream of consciousness podcast. But don't worry, the leadership takeaways are priceless. I can't wait for you to meet Jim Roth, the very first board member I've interviewed on this podcast. Hey, have you ever wished you could hear some good news for a change? Well, I might have just what you've been hoping for. Welcome to Your Nonprofit Life, where we remove our rose-colored glasses and explore what leaders are actually doing to move their nonprofits from messy to thriving without burning out in the process. I'm Laura Zelke, Director of Member Experience for the Nonprofit Leadership Lab. Join me each week to explore the ups, downs, and whoopsie daisies of your nonprofit life. Let's get started. Good morning, Jim. It's nice to see you again.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
Before we get started, I just wanted to check and see how you're doing up there.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, we live about 2 miles from what I would call the epicenter of where this all took place, where George Floyd was killed and where a lot of the aftermath took place. I don't want to characterize it because people are characterizing it different ways depending on their points of view. But it's been a very eerie period of time. We're traumatized, but there are people who are a lot more traumatized than we are, who were more directly involved in it. We do have some extended family members who are much more traumatized by it than my wife and I. But there's emerging a sense of hope. I mean, citizens are participating in the cleanup, and there is a lot of hope, but there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
I will just say that, yes, I think Minneapolis is epicenter of everything that seems to be.
It really is.
Around the country and around the world right now. And I mean, I hope that that also means that this horrible event is a catalyst for appropriate changes.
I know your background, you've been an attorney for years, right? Like that's your nonprofit background.
Yeah, I was licensed to practice law in 1978.
Oh, wow. Let's see. That was right about the time when Star Wars was first coming out.
Yes, it was.
Saturday Night Fever. What kind of stuff were you working on back then?
Well, initially, I worked for a firm in private practice. I did commercial litigation. Eventually, as it became more specialized, it evolved into more focus on employment law, discrimination cases, sexual harassment, defamation-related cases. But I developed a side interest in essentially international human rights, but it was always human rights focused. And even as an attorney, I represented some small nonprofits in the community. For instance, I represented an organization called Center School, and that was a small school in the Native American population. It catered primarily to Native American students who were dropping out of the Minneapolis public schools. So I was their outside attorney, and in fact, I was the attorney who helped them with their foundation documents. Filing for 501c3 status. So I worked very closely with that community. Another small school that I represented was called Metro Deaf School. And that was a school that was focusing on the concept of teaching students and focusing on American Sign Language. And so I had a pretty broad-based practice, but a lot of it was focused on issues that aren't really very far from human rights issues.
Right. It sounds to me like your life has really been built around facing difficult issues and then finding solutions that bring people together and, I guess, guarantee human rights. Like, is that part of your mission, like your personal mission in life?
Yeah, human rights are, I would say, my core mission. I have other values too, but I mean, this is why I've worked with the groups that I have over time. It's the ones that I'm drawn to. And I don't know, I guess that's part of the values I was raised with.
Mm.
And then it just evolved more over time. I had the opportunity to work with some wonderful people who let me further develop my interests in international human rights. But I also say I'm interested in human rights because I'm not only interested in international human rights, because I think there's a link between human rights at home and internationally. And that is also something that's being played out right now in terms of the events in Minneapolis and what's happening in other parts of the world. So, they're linked together, but at the same time, there are differences between human rights issues in the United States and human rights issues in, say, Russia, Poland, or Hungary, or Brazil, any number of places, but they're interrelated.
Yeah. And I just want to, first of all, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. We have barely scratched the surface. Let me ask you this. As a lawyer who really focused a lot on human rights issues as far as the different cases that you represented, did that have anything to do with how you ended up on boards?
Yeah, I was still a lawyer in private practice when a handful of young idealistic lawyers, and it also happened to include the then mayor of Minneapolis, Don Fraser, decided that even though Minneapolis seemed to be a long ways away from what you would, I suppose, describe as the epicenter of international human rights issues, we formed a group called the Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Committee. And we went through all the stages of forming that entity. And the name now is Advocates for Human Rights. But that was in the early 1980s. I was involved in the formation and the building of that group. And then shortly thereafter, there was another group started here that was, in part based on Advocates for Human Rights because it involved some of the same people, but it also involved efforts by the then governor in Minnesota, Rudy Perpich, and several leaders at the University of Minnesota, including doctors at the medical school and many administrators. But from that emerged the Center for Victims of Torture. And I was also very active in that from the formative stage and continuing for many years. So yes, those did kind of evolve out of my practice as a lawyer.
It seems like you're either finding a need and getting on a board and getting an organization started, or seeing it through changes, or seeing the need to represent and getting in and doing that. And I would like to learn a little bit more about the organization that you're with right now. And so can you tell me a little bit about One Voice, what the organization does, like the elevator pitch, or what's the mission?
Okay, well, the mission is building community and creating social change by raising our voices in song. The organization was really formed during the AIDS crisis, and part of it was to bring together community members. Back at that time, there was a lot of division between gays and lesbians. And part of the idea here was to bring them together to unite around a mission. And actually, at the time, that was kind of revolutionary because there were a lot of divisions within the community, but they united around this issue, and they united around the idea of singing together, which it's a very powerful mechanism when you think about it. But it was formed in the late 1980s. Again, it was formed from scratch like those nonprofits I had been involved in before. Initially, one of my wife's cousins, Steve, sent an email to me when I happened to be in Washington, D.C., lobbying on a foreign policy issue. And I knew he had been active in One Voice Mixed Chorus. Part of it was that he knew of my background working on all these human rights issues and my interest in them. And so he thought that I might be interested and I might have something to add to the board.
What is his connection with One Voice?
Well, he was a singer in One Voice for many years. And more of the context for that is he is gay, and he is basically my wife's peer cousin. They were always somewhat close growing up together, but there were issues about gays being accepted. I even remember when I was in junior high and high school, I remember how gays were being treated. And, beyond that, you got to remember, I grew up in the 60s. And, the whole evolution of the gay rights movement didn't really start until about the time I started college. And that was just the beginning of that movement. I want to mention to you, too, that, yes, Steve was the one who connected us with One Voice Mixed Chorus, but one of my closest friends from high school is gay, and one of the cousins I'm closest to is gay. And so these issues were important to me personally as well as professionally. But yeah, it was Steve who connected with me by that email, who asked if I might be interested in serving on the board. And so after that, the board president followed up with me and so on and so forth. And among other things, the chorus usually has 3 major concerts a year. And then a very important part of the mission is a program called Out in Our Schools. And the chorus goes into schools really in the region, not solely in the Twin Cities, not solely in Minnesota, and works with school choruses and with young people, usually junior high and high school, to bring the message in with them and to create some support and solidarity with younger people who are still searching.
Yeah. Do you think that was actually something that really did start to catalyze bringing everybody together?
Well, I think it was definitely part of it. That movement has evolved over time and has been more unification between people who have the various identities as having like one united mission. There's still various divisions within the community, just like I think you could say there's still divisions within the Black community and other minority communities. But there has overall been a movement toward unification, toward a common purpose. And I mean, One Voice Mixed Chorus evolved from being a gay and lesbian chorus to being an LGBTQ and allies chorus. And so it has evolved over time as well.
And allies. So there are people who are even cisgender, heterosexual, that are part of the chorus. So it's really a community chorus.
Now are allies, and there are several allies on the board, and including many supporters as well. So allies have become an important component of the chorus. I mean, let me just say this about allies, because the word has gotten tossed around a lot now in terms of what really is an ally. But one of my perspectives over time from the various issues and causes that I've worked on is we all need allies. They're very important. And allies don't necessarily share every single of our own beliefs and perspectives, but they're allied around common ideals and missions. And so I think that has been an important component in the evolution of One Voice Mixed Chorus. But the allies have to be aligned with the cause and the mission.
Well, of course, that's what makes them the ally. I believe that what you just shared is absolutely spot on. It sounds to me like One Voice is really a place that if someone were to come out, they could go there and they would know that they would be accepted and welcomed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a community. And I mean, actually, within One Voice itself, it is an extended family in many ways. And, as you mentioned, a lot of people, when they come out as gay or lesbian or transgender or bisexual, some variant, they're not accepted by their immediate families. I mean, the population of homeless kids in the US, 40% of it is LGBTQ kids who've basically been kicked out by their families.
Wow.
And so a lot of people who've grown up, when they realize who they are and they start to come to grips with it and how they want to and need to lead their lives, they're kind of abandoned by their nuclear families. And so then where do you go?
Yeah. One of the questions I've been wanting to ask you is, what is a challenge that you've had as far as being on a board, being in board service all these years? Have you had any challenges that, come to mind that are challenges that you overcame and that would help the listeners as they're thinking through their own issues?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's the startup phase, and I try to analogize that to being like the startup phase of a business, except in some ways even more difficult. I mean, you have to go through those difficult first steps. And I think you referred a little bit earlier in terms of, are you going to be able to hire any staff? Do you have to rely entirely on volunteers? Even a formative stage, like, are we going to form a 501c3? I mean, those are all steps that you have to go through. And so the thing I would say about that is there are now many organizations who can provide help through those stages, including the Nonprofit Leadership Lab and many others. So, I would definitely say to take advantage of those, because the startup phase for a nonprofit is very, very difficult. And so you need to take advantage of the resources that you have to help you through those. And I think whether you want to call them peers or allies or whatever you want to call them, there are resources now that you can reach out to help you through those steps. You don't have to do it alone, but that is a very difficult phase. But there's also kind of a life cycle of nonprofits, and there are issues in all of the stages of the life cycle. And
oh no, don't tell me that.
Back to an earlier phase in some parts of your life cycle. It's not like a straight line forward.
Right.
So one of the things is you got to be in for it for the mission that you're on, and you can't lose track of that. But yes, I mean, one other things I'll say is find your allies where you can, because your allies can help you with your mission. So it's really, really important to try to figure out who could be our allies here, whether that means a foundation or a corporation or individuals. You know, you have to be creative in terms of thinking, who's going to help us advance this mission? So the startup phase is very difficult. Board succession is a difficult issue. And this is one of the things I think I had mentioned to you before in terms of the Advocates for Human Rights and the Center for Victims of Torture and One Voice Mixed Chorus have now all survived past their 30-year anniversaries.
Wow.
Really, in order to do that, it can't be focused on one or two or three people. There has to be a plan for how this organization is going to evolve past the founders, past the founding board members, and bring in new blood. And so that's very important, is to constantly keep a focus on what's the new blood we're going to bring in and how are we going to do it. And then you have to mentor and train the people who come in. And they're not necessarily always younger people, although that's very important, but it might just be somebody different. And they're now at a stage in their life where they want to get involved in something like that. And I mean, I'll mention to it because I fit within this category myself, but there are baby boomers who didn't start out like I did with getting involved in the nonprofits that I did, who would like to get involved in nonprofits. I mean, here in Minnesota, there actually is an organization that helps connect people who are interested in nonprofit service with nonprofits. And there may be in other places too, but I mean, I think you should remember that you can reach out to an organization like that and say, we want to find a couple new board members. Can you help us? So that's one thing. But I think another thing that I have to mention right now is no matter what stage of development a nonprofit is in, right now, an enormous issue is survival. So even for mature nonprofits, they're being jerked back into the stage of trying to figure out how are we going to survive. Both the boards and the leadership in the executive director and others need to realize that you might have to reach into a totally different bag of tricks for the next thing that you didn't see coming.
Right. I know you had mentioned earlier that One Voice does 3 concerts a year.
Usually 3.
Usually 3, right? Usually. But it's 2020 and nothing is usual in 2020.
No concerts.
No concerts at all. What are you doing?
There was a concert earlier in the year before the pandemic struck, but no concerts for the rest of the year.
And were those fundraisers?
Well, they are all in part. I mean, that's part of the fundraising mechanism to make money from the concerts. But, you know, there's some other fundraising events too. But being thrown out of being able to have that as a part of your ongoing funding efforts is a huge blow. And not only for our chorus, but I happen to know for choruses around the country.
Well, sure. Yeah. You know, when I think about what you do at One Voice, it's a community. Do you know how your community is staying together during this time? Because I know that it's been a real struggle for people who sing. I know one of our members, Heidi Dressler, is very, very active in the lab and in the You're Thriving nonprofit Facebook group. And they go sing at people's hospital beds, like when they're dying. And they haven't been able to do that. It's just such a challenge right now. And I think for people, we're talking about the LGBTQ community, that this is the thing that they look forward to, is coming together and practicing and doing performances, yet you can't get together to practice. So how's your staff? Do you have an executive director and some staff?
Yeah, we have an executive director and an artistic director and an operations coordinator.
What are they doing to keep everyone connected during this time?
Creative Zooming. Instead of having a rehearsal every Monday night, there's a Zoom gathering on Monday night. And it's really to stay connected. It's become quite creative. There's usually some singing, but it's a little bit difficult to sing over Zoom. So it's become more of a sing-along. And so among other things, they've replayed songs from past concerts, and then the people at home can sing along if they'd like. They read poetry that they've written. They share stories. They get together faithfully every Monday night via the miracle of Zoom.
Yeah.
And they make community. Now, the difficulty of that is that becomes confined to our own smaller community. The outreach is much more difficult. But, another thing that the chorus has done is reached out to Minnesota Public Radio and helped to organize and perform what's called Bring the Sing. So every Friday night at 5:00 on NPR, there will be some song that's played and everybody is invited to sing along. So that's a broader event, but it's cool. And I mean,
that is really cool.
Was inspired in part by all the people who are trying to support doctors and nurses and first responders in various ways.
Yeah, I love that. And so let me ask you this. You're a board member. How did you find out about all that?
About all what?
Everything you just shared, that they're doing Zooms. Oh, what? Wait a minute. Say that again. You what?
I participate in them.
As a board member?
Yes.
What?
Yes.
You mean board members can participate in things that the organization does on a regular basis?
Sure.
And actually know what's going on and be involved?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a requirement, but we're encouraged to be part of the organization.
Okay.
So there's not like a total division between board members and community members and staff, but not all board members do that either. I'll also tell you that in a group like this, some of the board members are also singers.
Yeah.
And some are past singers. And so there's intermixing between the board and the community, I guess I would say. We're part of the community.
Well, you are. And the thing is, I was kind of being a little sarcastic there because so many members have shared just the disconnect that they feel with their boards. And so I was just kind of teasing you. But at the same time, I know a lot of executive directors who encourage their boards to come to things. I'm thinking of one particular member who has a gallery and is always encouraging the board to come participate if there's like an event at the location. And it's like pulling teeth.
Oh, it can be. But here's the thing. To me, it's part of a board member's responsibility to be engaged in the ongoing activities. It should be part of the job description.
Right.
But if it isn't, I mean, you should be so interested in the mission of your organization that you don't even need to be encouraged, that you should want to do it. And I mean, that's always been my view in terms of board involvement is I want to be involved in the organization, including with the employees. And I've always thought that board members need to be that invested in what's going on. I think it must be a different model of board involvement if there's no board involvement in terms of those activities. And the executive director shouldn't have to beg board members to be more involved in the lifeblood of the organization. But if it's an organization where that's not part of the culture, I think you need to try to figure out how to change that. Because board members should not just view themselves as board members. They should consider themselves as part of the nonprofit community, I guess is the word I'd say.
It's more than just governance.
Yes.
I think that this is something really important that listeners can take away. You've had so much board experience and you've helped build boards. And I want to just see if you can help me tie these two things together. What do you do when you have a board that's disengaged and there are no term limits? Where do you even go find the new blood to bring in a way that it will not be infected by the lack of involvement of the current board? Have you ever had to go through anything like that?
Well, I mean, I guess all I can say about that is I don't think that any of the organizations that I've been closely involved with have had that issue. I mean, I will say that different board members have different time and professional requirements and so on. But I mean, I'll give you an example, and this is a kind of an extreme example. In the early stages of the Center for Victims of Torture, the people who were inviting in new board members, and later on I became one of them, but they would look for a variety of skill sets, I guess you would say, in terms of who was brought in. And we were very fortunate because one of the board members who became involved and was very important in the survival in the earliest stages was a mutual fund manager, a very successful one. And he attended board meetings, but not every board meeting because his time limits wouldn't let him, but he would make a substantial financial contribution every year. And in the early stages, there was only one person like that.
Right.
And he was the person.
And so that helps. It kind of makes up for that. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if you can find people who are making important contributions in different ways, but I think they should all still be encouraged to be as involved as possible without interfering with the functioning of the organization. But still, they should be personally heavily invested in what's going on. And I guess, part of it, because I got involved in leadership positions in the organizations, is I worked closely with the executive directors and with many of the employees. I mean, one of the things at the Center for Victims of Torture is I came from a legal background. And now all of a sudden, a lot of the people who I was working closely with were doctors and therapists and nurses and social workers. It was interesting because they taught me a lot. And one of the issues for me was moving from a culture that was more adversarial to one that was really focused on healing. And, it was very interesting for me as a board member, but it was also transformational in my own personal development.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't I want to get more invested in it?
Right. I guess the moral of the story is that when you're creating your board, you're pulling together a team, and it's not just so you can check off all the different boxes of, do you have a lawyer? Do you have a this? Do you have a that? But it is also looking at the culture that you're creating within the board and the culture that you're creating in your organization.
It's not an easy thing to do, but I mean, I think that's what you have to do is try to find board members who are going to look at the organization more holistically. And board members have different motivations. And honestly, what I've seen over time is there's some board members who frankly just want to pump up their resume,
right? Which
is to me disgusting, but at the very least disappointing. But those are not the board members you want.
Right. And it's having that discernment of who to bring on. And here's a revelation. You can take this one to the bank. It's okay to have someone apply to be a board member. It's okay to say no.
Right.
It's okay to say no. You're not a good fit. Good luck. Hope you can find an organization. And we'd love to have you come serve as a volunteer, but being on our board, not a good match. And that's okay. It's okay to do that. You're actually protecting your board culture. You're protecting your organization when you can have some discernment and some agency to say, not a good fit.
Yeah. And I mean, hopefully you can do it diplomatically.
Of course.
So the person doesn't go away so angry that they start bad-mouthing you in the community.
Right.
But they still remain interested in what you're doing.
Right.
But that's where some diplomacy comes in too, because
it's
very hard to diplomatically turn away somebody who applies to be a board member. But it's also necessary.
I think it's critical. You've got to know who you're looking for. And I think maybe some of that too is framing it up to just say, we really do want you to apply, but I want to be very clear with you that we don't accept every application that comes in. And so if we come back and say, not a good match, please don't take it personally that this is something that we're doing. We have a set of guidelines, or we have some certain things that we're looking for right now. And if you're not a good match, we are going to say no. Like, it's just framing it up, getting things in order so that you're protecting your culture. Because one toxic board member or one person coming in that's just completely the wrong match can cause so much drama.
True.
Yeah.
I'm definitely trying to put your antennae up and try to avoid getting toxic board members.
Yeah, I don't think anybody specifically chooses to go out and do that. It's just something that you have to trust your gut, I think, and know that it's okay to say no. So we've kind of gone all over the place in this podcast interview here. Jim, I'm so grateful for your time and just the expertise that you've offered to show just a diverse background. And you've had a career as an attorney. And while you were serving as an attorney, you've been doing all this other board service to help make the world a better place. Thank you for being the kind of person that is still engaged. Here you are in Minneapolis with the call that has come up this week to defund the police. I'm guessing you're probably involved in some of the conversations around that and what that's going to end up looking like, or the proposals. And I think you might be getting some email offers of joining other boards when this is over.
Well, I'll be selective. I can't join every board. But, I'm still happy to talk with people if they want to talk with me about issues.
Oh, well, that's so kind.
The thing is, I know that you have a very capable group, and you yourself are very capable in terms of trying to help people find their way through doing very worthy things in very difficult circumstances. But I'll just put in a plug for myself. I'm a pro bono consultant. It's part of what I am now. I help people and I don't charge them.
Wow.
That's not to say under no circumstances would I ever do that again, but there's a reason why I left the culture of charging people by the hour and writing down my time and everything else. And that's because I wanted to be freer to do the things that I want to do for the groups that will most benefit from them. But the groups that I work with now in kind of this informal consulting capacity, when they call me about some issue, they always say, you can always say no. And I always tell them, well, I know how to say no. And when I need to say no, I will say no.
Yeah. Well, you may get some phone calls. I don't know. With things the way they are right now in this world, I am grateful that we have someone like you who's doing pro bono service and consulting to kind of help people with human rights issues and healing the world. I mean, that's really the goal here. And so if people do want to get in touch with you or learn more about One Voice, and I will put links to all these different organizations that we've talked about. Okay, you started the one organization and the name...
Advocates for Human Rights is the name of it now.
Advocates for Human Rights. It was a little longer when you started it.
Minnesota Lawyers International Human Rights Committee.
Yeah, I think changing the name was probably a good idea.
We evolved, and that was through board retreats that it eventually changed.
Yeah, smart move. And the Center for Victims of Torture and One Voice, and we'll put links to all of that on the site. So what is the best way for people to get in touch with you, Jim Roth?
Connect on LinkedIn, James Roth. I'm also on Facebook if somebody wants to try to do there.
Great. And I will put that up on the show notes page so that people can get in touch with you. And I have to say, this has been a great conversation. I am in awe of your board superpowers and the ability that you have to bring people together and create something that is lasting to then let it go and move on and do something else. You're having such an impact and leaving a legacy of solid leadership and mentorship to those who are coming behind you. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add as an afterword, it's something that I thought of. This was years earlier in my career. I didn't even know this, but some of the other lawyers had nominated me for a position as an advisor to the Minnesota Supreme Court on what organizations does the state of Minnesota help provide funding to. It was pro bono legal services organizations would apply for funding. And there was somebody else who had applied who was a very prominent, well-connected local lawyer. And the State Bar Association decided to submit my name for that position. And one of the persons who was involved in the selection later explained to me that the reason we chose you is that you show up for meetings.
Well, I mean, thank you. On behalf of all the executive directors that you've worked with, thank you for showing up to board meetings.
And also showing up beyond board meetings, which
and
is
beyond, right.
Earlier.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for setting a really good example for how to be a board member.
Thank you. I look forward to following you and the village, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and it's very enjoyable for me too.
Thank you again for your time, and I will see you in the village. Thanks for listening. To access the show notes or share feedback on this podcast and link over to our socials, visit our website at yournonprofitlife.com. That's yournonprofitlife.com. And hey, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you're going to love The Village. It's our exclusive online community where we take what we're learning in the Nonprofit Leadership Lab and apply it. We take it to the next level with live Q&As, boot camps, online book clubs, and legit support from experts committed to helping you extend your nonprofit life. By the way, since we're just getting started, it would mean the world to us if you'd subscribe to the podcast and leave a great review on iTunes. The reviews will help us get the podcast in front of more people as we try to take the whole sector from messy to thriving. See you next time.